So I'm going to start off this sermon a little grouchy. I won't stay that way. You might not be surprised that I'm not such a great fan of that school of thinking that says a person experiences God more clearly in nature than in a congregation. That's in part because, sure, I'll bet it is easier to feel spiritual out there where you don't have to worry about other human beings' needs or opinions, but the bigger part of my grouchiness is because it's a false dichotomy. I figure experiencing the transcendence of the animal and plant life around us and being a part of a congregation where there are people working together to follow the lead of love itself are two sides of the same coin, forging a connection with the holy. And they're better when they're paired together. So setting aside my grouchiness about people who find nirvana without helping another person. I will say that in this effort of connecting to the holy, nature is an indispensable source of wisdom. I, of course, as most of us have, experienced it firsthand. One of my favorite parenting moments happened on a hiking trail near the little Ohio River town of Madison, Indiana. Sasha was maybe 3 or 4 years old, and already she loved to hike with Heather and me. I say with us, she liked to amble ahead of us, sometimes running in that top-heavy way little ones do, looking like she was always about to fall face first into the dirt until we caught up with her. There was very little danger in that. The trails in Indiana are often soft from the rain, and the green canopy overhead shades them. So hiking was a chance for her to be a relatively feral kid for a while. And I think that's really good for them. One day it was just Sasha and me hiking on this beautiful Indiana spring day when up ahead we spotted a snake in the path. But we could tell something was going on with this snake. It had stopped in the middle of the trail and it seemed to be struggling. As we sort of crept up closer and closer, we saw that the snake was having a frog for breakfast. Now, this was not the frog's plan for its morning. That, too, was clear, and it was kicking and squirming and doing its best to wrangle itself out of the snake's mouth and off the menu, but to no avail. Sasha and I watched as the snake slowly dragged its meal off the path, keeping an eye on us, and swallowed it. That was a transcendent moment. I wasn't thinking about anything except that snake and that frog and my little one. Sasha, too, was completely engrossed. We couldn't wait to tell everybody we knew about that snake and that frog and what we saw. We've talked about it for years since, as you can see. Transcendence. This month I've so enjoyed planning our worship services around that theme. I've talked about transcendence itself, this possibility of connecting with something greater than the individual person. And we've talked about Fuller and Emerson, two of the great American transcendentalists. Today I want to sort of combine transcendence and transcendentalism and use the writing of another transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, as a central text. I want to use that to sort of meander around and through the importance of nature as a source of transcendence. Before Thoreau, though, a long time before, were the ancient Taoists. They didn't have a sense, it seems to me, of separation from all the life forms around us, the way we do in the modern Western world. They didn't have this idea that humans are most important and everything else is the environment, or worse, a resource. Instead, they said the only way to really experience Tao, the only way to really connect to what some might call God, is to observe nature. For them, nature wasn't a resource but a teacher. It was holy in and of itself, just as it is. If we're still long enough to pay attention, they said, the earth would teach us the way we should behave. And a lot of the practices in Taoism are meant to help us calm down and pay attention. I find their writings to be curative for the idea that I should conquer nature, by having a perfectly manicured lawn or some other totally ridiculous thing that's never going to happen. Henry David Thoreau thought similarly about lawns and the like. In one place, he even prescribed building houses where the windowsills butt right up next to the swamp that he was familiar with. He said something like, "You don't have to have a front door, people can come in the back." Maybe that's evidence why, as one biographer said, quote, "Thoreau was not a big hit during his lifetime." But I mostly like him anyway. The rest of that biographer's assessment is why I like him. He said, as someone who believed that it was a person's duty to fight injustice wherever it reared its ugly head, and remember that Thoreau refused to pay his taxes for a while because they were going to support war. Thoreau often rubbed people the wrong way with his rejection of the materialism and conformity that ruled others' lives and made them susceptible to moral and ethical failings, end quote. Today, his book, Walden, about his 2 years living in pseudo-isolation in a shack on Emerson's property, is incredibly popular. He conducted his experiment in wilderness living the way I might have, with occasional trips into town to buy good snackies and get a hot meal from a pal and do his laundry. Also, his essay, Civil Disobedience, is in the background of a whole host of social justice movements, and his writing on nature has become must-read material for environmentalists. And that's the part of his writing I want to focus on this morning for a few minutes. Here's a sample of his writing from his essay, Walking, in which he does something really, I think, fun and interesting with the word sauntering. He wrote, "I have met with but one or two persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under pretense of going à la Santerre, or to the Holy Land, till the children exclaimed, 'There goes a saunterer, a Holy Lander.'" It seems just from reading Thoreau a bit that he must have been called lazy for taking long walks in nature. He gets defensive. But in the reading above, he turns that insult, just sauntering, into a description of what he sees as the result of walking, a trip to holy ground. And he had a little more to say on the subject in the same essay. He seems to be asking, "You want to call me a vagrant?" And then he writes this: "He who sits still in a house all the time may be the greatest vagrant of all. But the saunterer, in the good sense, is no more vagrant than the meandering river, which is all the while sedulously seeking the shortest course to the sea. But I prefer the first, which indeed is the most probable derivation, for every walk is a sort of crusade, preached by some Peter the Hermit inside us, to go forth and reconquer the Holy Land from the hands of the infidels." I like that a lot. Those passages remind me that in our culture, sometimes we have to get over the idea that we should always be busy with industry, busy producing, before we can go on a hiking trip and roll or walk on those trails to experience transcendence. We probably need to do what Thoreau did and develop a thick skin, which almost always issues from understanding ourselves and what we believe well enough to not care so much what other people accuse us of. To paraphrase Will Rogers, what other people think of us is none of our business. And we live better without dwelling on it. But sometimes a walk is work. Henry David knew that a hike could be a good place to solve a big problem. That was the source of some of what is, at least on the face of it, his weirdest advice. Whereas the Bengals instructed us to walk like an Egyptian, Thoreau says we should walk like a camel. Here's what he says: "Moreover, you must walk like a camel, which is said to be the only beast which ruminates when walking. When a traveler asked Wordsworth's servant to show him her master's study, she answered, 'Here is his library, but his study is out of doors.'" There's a little bit of Taoist wisdom there, I think. Pay attention to nature, and the solutions to your problems, the Taoists would call it right action, will become apparent to you. My only advice would be to bring along a pen and notebook, because if your brain is anything like mine, you'll forget on the way home. Now, the Transcendentalists, and if you read them, you know this, have read them, you know this, they made something of a sport out of contradicting themselves. Emerson was really proud of it. There's a story, it might be apocryphal, but he was delivering a lecture somewhere, and he got to the middle of it, and he paused. He looked down, he looked up at the people congregated there, and he said, "I no longer believe that." And then he kept going. So they were okay with contradicting themselves, with new wisdom replacing old wisdom. They seem to have loved to do it. Even seen it, they seem to have seen it as proof that they are imbued with the divine, and the divine tells them what the new thing is. So they said, follow your inner wisdom, even if it contradicts yesterday's wisdom. So to that end, after he says we should ruminate like camels when we hike, Thoreau later in the same essay says we should forget all about our everyday lives when we hike and think only about nature. He wrote, I am alarmed when it happens that I've walked a mile into the woods bodily without getting there in spirit. In my afternoon walk, I would fain forget all my morning occupations and my obligations to society, but it sometimes happens that I cannot easily shake off the village. The thought of some work will run in my head, and I am not where my body is. I'm out of my senses. In my walks, I would fain return to my senses. What business have I in the woods if I'm not thinking of something out of the woods, or if I am thinking of something out of the woods? I suspect myself and cannot help but shudder when I find myself so implicated, even in what are called good works, for this sometimes happens. So I think the camel and forget all about your other life while you're in the woods, I think he's right about both things. It's good sometimes to ruminate while we're in nature. It offers us new perspectives. It helps us think outside the path we get on, the well-worn ruts in our day-to-day lives. But when we can, it's so helpful to just roll or walk along the trail or just sit outside if that's what's possible for us and think of nothing but the lizard that scampers across the path, cactus bloom that lends its beauty to the day, or the breeze for which we offer deepest thanks this time of year. There's something about being outside that's holy in and of itself, and I think that's maybe because deep in ourselves, we're always remembering that we came from the earth. It's our first parent. Not in some abstract sense, but in reality. The earth gives birth to us. We have to be reminded of that from time to time. And importantly, to us Unitarian Universalists, it's also true that the earth is our shared destiny. Whatever else we believe might happen after we die, we know for sure that our bodies return to the earth. Whether our consciousness survives, a lot of the stuff of our bodies is still a part of this amazing interdependent web of life after it returns to the earth that gave it rise. We certainly don't want to wind up like the surveyor and property owner that Thoreau came upon during one of his walks. The guy's fence had fallen into disrepair, and so he wasn't absolutely clear anymore where his property ended. So this fella, on a beautiful spring day, had to survey the property to figure it out. He hired a surveyor, and out to the property they went. And Thoreau wrote, I saw the fences half consumed, their ends lost in the middle of the prairie, and some worldly miser with a surveyor looking after his bounds while heaven had taken place around him. And he did not see the angels going to and fro, but was looking for an old post hole in the midst of paradise. Let it never be said of us that we spent our lives looking for old post holes in the midst of paradise, wishing we had a better this or that thing, working for that, maybe a bigger house or a fancier car or some such, while the Sonoran Desert does its best to stun us with its sometimes hidden beauty. Let us instead notice and enjoy the beauty of life around us. So much of the environmental suffering happening today, the deforestation and extinction of species and trashing of the oceans and the like, I think have their root in the problem of our having fallen out of love with nature. In the Industrial Revolution, we created great heaving machines that belch smoke and pollutants into the sky, all with the goal of making human life easier and faster, of satisfying human greed. We didn't used to know how bad all that was for us and for other forms of life, but now we do. And part of the solution must be to fall back in love with the soil and the animals and the plants and all the natural beauty that surrounds us, to see all of it for the miracle that it is. See, in our faith tradition, at least the way I see it, transcendence is a means to an end. We don't go to the hiking trail to stay there. We don't go there in hopes of levitating into the heavens, although if that happens, please take photos and let us know. We certainly don't go to the hiking trail as a replacement for working with one another. We go to nature because we know we must do so to return energized, whole, in touch with love itself, and ready to be the kind of citizens, the kind of family members who can really love one another across boundaries, who can create and recreate a healthy democracy and be part of the effort to preserve the planet. We go to nature for those things, for the strength to do that work. I conclude with the words Thoreau used to conclude his essay, Walking. So we saunter toward the Holy Land, till one day the sun shall shine more brightly than ever it has done, shall perchance shine into our minds and hearts, and light up our whole lives with a great awakening light, as warm and serene and golden as on a bankside in autumn. May those moments of transcendent sunlight be ours on and off the trail. Amen.